Well, I'm really excited to be able to speak to you today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions. How many people were at the climate march on Sunday? So you're one of more than 300,000 people, maybe closer to 400,000 people who walked down the streets of New York City, the largest climate march in US history, probably in world history, and probably the largest mass demonstration or mobilization on behalf of a cause in at least 20 years as it was being billed. And what was interesting about the march, was even different from some of the marches of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, is it was a leaderless march. There was no stage where people giving speeches. There was no recognized figurehead or celebrity at the head of the march. Here you can see, as we'll talk about, just 5 or 6 years ago, the major figure in American climate politics and also talking about climate science was Al Gore, former Vice President Al Gore. Here he is, one of many marching in the streets along with the mayor of New York City. Jane Goodall is next to him, the head of the United Nations. And I believe that's Chuck Schumer on the other side there, senator from New York State. So I was actually in New York on Sunday giving a presentation, a day-long discussion and a presentation to a major foundation there, where in fact actually we were talking about some of the issues I'll raise in this talk. Specifically, how can the philanthropic world, in collaboration with universities, media organizations, NGOs, other groups within civil society, how can we make a breakthrough difference in, as I'll talk about, managing and dealing with this super wicked problem of climate change. And there's a great deal of excitement now. This march is being talked about as a major tipping point, potentially, for climate politics, when the public and maybe politicians finally get the urgency of the issue. But I want to start today by taking you back to 2007, because back in 2007, we had a very similar discussion about, at the time, that this could be a potential historic tipping point on climate change. And back in 2006 and 2007, some of our largest foundations in the country, in the world, came together to try to study the problem of climate change and to figure out a funding model, a path forward on how to move society along in dealing with that problem. And at the time, there was a similar sense of urgency coming off of Hurricane Katrina. And then with the sensational success of Al Gore's film, Inconvenient Truth, which made more than $100 million at the box office, he shared an Academy Award. He eventually shared a Nobel Prize with the IPCC scientists. Journalists at the time were talking about how his film had been a tipping point for public opinion, that the public finally got it. And before we were talking about Barack Obama as a possible next president, we were talking about Al Gore. And similar today, the country's mood seemed to have shifted to the left after a period of the Bush administration, which had been received a lot of criticism and controversy over its handling of climate policy, along with other issues. And so these major foundations came together, and they hired a consulting team to interview more than 100 scientists, economists, and engineers to come up with a blueprint for how to move forward on climate change. And here's how they define the path forward. The report that they came out, called the Design to Win report, had a very strong focus on the marketplace as the principal mechanism for change. The report talked about how a cap on carbon output in an accompanying market for emissions permits will prompt a sea change that washes over the entire global economy. The good news is that we already have the technology and know-how to achieve these carbon reductions, often at a cost savings. So there was, the problem was defined as a market failure, and the solution was to put a price on carbon. And the assumption, much like the discourse, the narrative that was offered by Gore in Inconvenient Truth and around the film, was that we have all the technology we need to solve the problem. So these major foundations, led by the Hewlett Foundation, which is one of our wealthiest foundations in the country and in the world, they set up a secondary foundation called ClimateWorks. And at the time, the program officer at the Hewlett Foundation, Hal Harvey, became the head then of ClimateWorks. And this is how Hal Harvey, in a profile at the New York Times, this is Harvey being interviewed by Tom Friedman in New York Times Forum. Here's how he defined the social challenge and the solutions to climate change. climate change, unlike a lot of large-scale problems, is actually one that is solvable. It is also one where we know what we need to do. We have the best data in the world on how to prevent climate change. Everything was ranked by magnitude, location, and sector. It's a systematic approach to problem solving. So the assumption from ClimateWorks and in this report was that economics and science were the principal tools by which we can understand climate change as a social problem, but they're also our principal persuasive tools. If we only communicated about the science and talked about the economic benefits of action, then that would break down the political and social barriers. And as the report talked about, it would create a wave across the economy that would start to then solve climate change as a social challenge. So here you can see the amount of money that in the foundations that came together around this plan, around this framing of climate change as a social challenge. So led by the Energy Foundation and ClimateWorks and Hewlett. What I did in a report that came out in 2011 is I went to the websites of these foundations and I looked at their annual reports and I put together a database of 1,248 grant descriptions and their amounts. And I totaled up the amount of giving that was done between 2008 and 2010, and there was some missing data there. And the total amount of grants that were distributed by these foundations on climate and energy were more than 368 million. That's a lot of money. And if you fill in the missing data and you take by the amount of grants that were given in the prior year, this amounts most likely over 500 million actually that they gave during this 3-year span of time. So how did these foundations then make decisions about where to invest, what to invest in strategies in dealing with the problem? For each one of these foundations grants, then they had a brief description, and I coded each description in terms of what was the focus of that grant, what was the technology strategy, what was potentially the analysis or the science or the economic analysis that was funded, what was the policy strategy that was supported, and if any type of communication or political strategy was involved. And this is one of the takeaways that I used from the report. There's a lot of different tables in the report, and I'll talk about where you can find that at the end of the talk. But you can see that, in fact, actually, the foundations follow the blueprint very closely and very effectively. So up here in the top, in terms of defining action on climate change and the solutions, in terms of setting a price on carbon and taking what's called a soft path approach, where the technologies that we need, where we need to focus to reduce emissions are on solar, wind, geothermal, and efficiency, and then other things like public transportation. They're very successful in following that plan. You can see that the amount of grants that were devoted to these things, along with the political strategy around cap and trade and an international agreement. On the other hand, people have argued, many experts and then also other NGO leaders and other funders have said, well, and as we'll talk about, these strategies are not enough. These technologies are not going to be able to get us where we need to in dealing with our emissions challenge, reducing our emissions. And we need to consider and evaluate, not only from a technical side, but also from a political side, other technologies, so-called hard path technologies, like carbon capture and storage for coal plants and natural gas plants. Evaluating natural gas, you can see there is very limited focus in, at the time, natural gas sort of being this catalytic force on our economy. Shifting us from coal and then natural gas as a potential bridge fuel. And zero funding out of 1,200 grants for nuclear energy, which a lot of experts argue that we need nuclear energy. People like, as we'll talk about, everyone from Nicholas Stern to Jeff Sachs are arguing that we need to think about nuclear energy and carbon capture. And then finally, at the bottom, we're talking a lot about resilience and adaptation today. But back in this period of time, there was almost no funding in these areas around resilience, adaptation, and importantly, this last March on Sunday, a lot of it was framed around the idea of climate justice. And a lot of the mobilization was around social justice, and almost no funding in the area of these human dimensions around public health and social justice. So now, if we fast forward in the wake of the march on Sunday, we have an almost completely different framing of climate change as a social challenge and what we need to do about it. And one of the places to look, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail in a little bit, is to look at Naomi Klein's new book. She's a Canadian journalist who's well known for books in the past on globalization and free trade as a sharp critic of it. And now she has a book out called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. How many people have heard about this book or seen this book? Okay. And her essential takeaway in the book, and this is from a documentary that will be released, the trailer to a documentary that will be released along with the book, is that she declares that our economic model is at war with life on Earth. Right? Climate change is not a market problem that market instruments can solve, like was the dominant framing in the lead up to cap and trade, but in fact actually inherently is something that we have to move away from capitalism as a system itself. We can't change the laws of nature, but we can change our growth economy. And that's why climate change is not just a disaster, it's also our best chance to demand and build a better world. In the concluding chapter of her book, she argues that the only way we're going to tackle climate change is to build a mass movement on the scale and with the force of the anti-slavery movement in the United States and the movement that ended colonialism in Africa and other parts of the developing world. And what she argues, in fact, actually is climate change is our chance then to do what we didn't do with those movements, and that is to seek economic justice for the people that were affected by colonialism and capitalism. So the instrument of change here is not insider lobbying. It's not thinking about the market as the method of change, but mass mobilization on a massive scale. And this march is a symbol of a lot of years of organizing and thinking about this new approach, especially in the wake of cap and trade, which failed, and most green NGO groups declared at that time what was missing was their ability to mobilize pressure on Congress for action. But what's similar about this movement is a similar technology bias or outlook on technology as the foundations, as I showed you just before. And that when you look at the signs during the protests, there's a strong opposition to fracking. There's a strong opposition to genetic engineering as part of the movement. There's an opposition to carbon capture and storage, as I'll talk about. This is from a different protest that was held in the UK last year, but a strong opposition for nuclear power for a number of different reasons, which I'll get into. So since at least 2007, I've been studying as a communication researcher the climate movement. And my initial assumptions as a communication researcher, in fact, was a fairly simplistic, naive model of social change. If you can communicate about the urgency of the issue, if you can communicate about the science, if you can frame it in a way that's more personally compelling and have more broader appeal, then you'll build up the public opinion intensity for social action to happen. As I'll talk about, what I didn't understand at that time when I first started studying this issue is that the policy frameworks and the technologies that you're talking about not only matter to actually meaningfully addressing the issue, but are also a big part of that political process and that part of political change. And that's what I'm going to focus on with you today. I'm going to focus on where do these stories come from? What influence do these narratives about climate change as a social problem have, and how do they fit into our biases, both our political biases, our social biases, our professional biases, and how can we break out of them so we can have a better, clear understanding of how we can actually make progress on this issue. One of the things that convinced me to rethink sort of the complexity of how I saw this problem was seeing a lot of presentations from scientists, NGO leaders, and reading a lot of things about economic growth and our emissions growth. And a lot of the focus in this seminar series will be on emissions growth and climate impacts. But Andrew Revkin, who I'll talk more about, who's a writer for the New York Times, has an interesting way of kind of reframing how we think about the climate challenge. In and around the march on Sunday, the hashtag on Twitter was People's Climate. And Revkin, in a post at his blog at .earth, said, "Well, we can't forget about people's energy." And what he says is that this balance, especially if you're thinking about social justice, is that there's more than 1 billion people without meaningful energy access who are living in energy poverty, as they describe. And when we think about the human condition, about human development, energy access and energy use is directly correlated with, in this case, in this figure, with the Human Development Index, which includes things like life expectancy, literacy, education, and standards of living. All of these countries on this side are all doing everything they can, much like the battle between Northeastern and Boston University rise the ranks, right? To get over here, right? They want to be over here with Harvard and Yale, which is the United States and the developing world, right? And so when they're told that they need to slow down their economic development, and they can't invest in things like nuclear energy or coal, and they have to focus on small-scale solar and wind, that's just not a realistic argument for them. That's never going to go anyplace in terms of negotiation, and it's not going to meet their societal needs, just from an equity and a justice perspective. So this is from a blog that you can find online, and again, I can provide my slides. My slides are also online at my website. If you think about economic growth, this is a picture from Shanghai in 1990, right? It's hard to believe. It almost looks something from 1900, the turn of the century, right? And this is a picture of Shanghai today. It's like something out of the movie Blade Runner, for those of you who've seen the Blade Runner, right? This is Dubai in 1990. It actually looks like Las Vegas in 1900, right? Some of these pictures are Atlanta in 1940, right? And this is Dubai today in 2007. So, here in the United States, unless we've traveled to these countries, it's hard for us to comprehend the changes that are going on. I can show you similar pictures of cities in India, or cities in China you've probably never even heard of. Some of you have probably, that are going through similar transformations. So the fastest growing cities and urban areas on Earth are happening in China, in India, and now Africa is also trying to catch up. So how do we meet their energy needs while also dealing with the problem of climate change? That's the ultimate question now. It's not only a political question, but it's a real question in terms of reducing emissions. Okay, this is from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. And if I can interpret some of these lines for you here, this is looking at total world primary energy consumption. And down below here, you can see the sort of the gradual increase in oil consumption over time. Developing countries like the United States and Europe become more energy efficient, but then developed countries become more energy efficient, but developing countries then come online. Here you can see the growth in natural gas, and the United States is at the head of this boom in natural gas. Up here in the gray, you can see the growth in reliance on coal. What this means is that not only are we heavily dependent on fossil fuels, but we have all this built-in infrastructure. Coal plants are being built now numbering in the hundreds, over 1,000, in places like China and India. And those coal plants will be around for the next 50 years. So how do we deal with the emissions from those coal plants? People are betting heavily on natural gas plants as well. In the middle here, you can see then the strongest renewables is among hydroelectric dams. And then you can see here other renewables, which would be wind and solar in the red. They are fast growing here in terms of percentage terms, but they're all still a very small slice of our energy dependence worldwide. And then finally, even if you look at the developed countries, even supposed success stories like Germany, they're still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. The countries that have been most successful at decarbonizing their economies today have been France, because they've invested heavily in nuclear power, and Brazil, because they have the resources to invest heavily in hydropower. Neither technologies, nuclear for sure and hydro, do environmentalists really like. And the cost, I can show you other figures about the cost of renewables remain very high relative to their alternatives. Okay, so how can we think about climate change as a social challenge? Why is it that, what kind of problem is it? And as I started to kind of rethink my approach to studying this problem, I started to come across literature in the policy sciences, but also a book that I really recommend in other writing by Mike Hume, who is the former director of the Tyndall Center in UK. And during the time as being director of the Tyndall Center, he really developed a very, in my mind, a very sophisticated sort of interdisciplinary understanding of where the sciences and the social sciences meet. And now he's at King's College in London as the professor of climate change and culture. And the idea of a wicked problem has been around in the policy science literatures for at least 30 years, but we can think about climate change as a super wicked problem. And a super wicked problem, there's no easy solution. There is no solution to a wicked problem. It's a condition that we have to do better or worse at in managing. We'll always be tackling climate change as a problem. It's never going to go away. Just like poverty might not ever go away, or war, or disease, right? We'll do better or worse in terms of avoiding the most severe impacts and how we come out the other side as a society. And the more complex a problem or uncertain a problem like climate change, the easier it is for equally plausible stories and narratives to exist about what to do about it. And I'll show you those stories. I started to show you those stories already. The contrasting stories between someone like Naomi Klein and Tom Friedman are pretty stark. There's a stark contrast there. And out of this complexity, climate change therefore serves for political leaders, for NGO groups, for funders, even journalists, as an opportunity to argue on behalf and mobilize on behalf of what people believe to be a good society, even down to the most tactical level. So in leading up to the climate march, for example, one of my favorite songwriters and singers, Paul McCartney, released a video saying, if you're going to the climate march, think about going meatless on Mondays, right? Because if we reduce our meat intake, we'll reduce carbon emissions, right? Climate change suddenly became an opportunity to argue on behalf of vegetarianism, right? So Paul McCartney, being a longtime vegetarian, and the groups associated with the video saw an opportunity there to argue on behalf of their cause. For Naomi Klein, climate change is an opportunity to right the wrongs that were not corrected at the end of slavery or at the end of colonialism, and to build a more socially just world, and to organize a whole diverse groups, like in that march, a whole diverse set of left-wing groups around a common set of policy solutions and a new vision for the economy and society. And as Mike Hume then argues, talking about these different examples, is that climate change becomes a synecdoche, a figurative turn of phrase in which something stands in for something else, right? For Tom Friedman or Al Gore, or Nicholas Stern, climate change is the ultimate market failure. And it's a way to build a new marketplace that favors things like solar and wind and geothermal and other renewables. For Naomi Klein, it's something different. So it becomes something much more important than simply the way humans are changing the weather, as Mike Hume writes. Okay, so that got me thinking about other ways then. So, okay, if we read into climate change our hope-for vision for the future, what else is involved? What affects then what we read into climate change in terms of uncertainty and how we perceive what should be done? One of those things is that I'm a science and risk communication researcher, and I've written a lot of different articles and done a series of studies, in fact, actually, on how scientists view the communication process. And over time, and this is from a paper that just came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by a friend of Jim and I's, Dietram Schleifele, who's at University of Wisconsin. Over time, we've started to move away from what scholars call a deficit model of communication for science, where we think that the key to communicating about a problem like climate change is simply to better translate the facts of the science and to train scientists to do so. To then what's called a public engagement with science model, where we need to move beyond simply the simple translation of the facts, and we need to move to places like science museums or public forums, where we bring the public together in interaction with scientists, stakeholders, and experts, and there's a two-way conversation about what science means and what should be done. Now, through a series of conferences and publications that the National Academies is called The Science of Science Communication, which I've participated in, and Jim and I will be at another meeting in a couple weeks, we've started to think, especially on issues like climate change, as science as political communication, right? That when these issues spilled out into public debate, whether it's climate change, food biotech, or stem cell research, there's all sorts of different interactions that start to happen. NGOs and how they frame the issues really matter, how journalists, the stories that they tell, and then our own interaction with those stories based on our own cognitive, social, and political biases. So if we accept that this is the reality of how climate change is debated, right? It's messy, it's bidirectional, it's unpredictable. Where do we then go in terms of thinking about then how people make decisions about societal strategies, what to do about it? Well, the first place we start is we have to think about we have to think beyond climate change within the social context within which we live today. This extreme era of not only income inequality, but as political scientists argue, connected income inequality, extreme political polarization. This is from a survey that came out a couple of months ago. There's quite stunning findings. The difference between 1994, one of the huge differences between 1994 and 2014 is that we have this disappearing center, not only among our political leaders, but among the broader public as well. These are based on answers to 10 different policy questions. And what you can see here is that those on the left who, on the 10 questions, the policy questions, consistently answer in the liberal direction have gone from 3% in 1994 to 12% in 2014. And among conservatives, it's remained roughly the same, right? As this liberal bloc, right, consistently liberal Americans has grown from a movement building, you talk to liberal interest groups, they're probably pretty happy about this. But the casualty for public discourse is that you have fewer and fewer people in the middle, right? And that probably undermines then the opportunity to reach agreement and compromise. And as I've written in other studies and articles, what we're seeing in campaigns, and at the end I'll talk about an article I just have out on this, in today's election campaigns leading up to the midterm election, is you literally have this ideological arms race, where now people like billionaire Tom Steyer investing in what conservatives developed as super PACs are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on political ads. Tom Steyer promising to spend $100 million on climate change alone, where Democrats are now spending more on super PACs than conservatives are, which is reversed from what happened in 2010 and 2012. Not only have we become more balkanized in terms of our worldviews, but as we become more balkanized, we prefer only to listen to and interact with people like ourselves. So this is also from the Pew report. And you can see when they asked, it's important for me to live in a place where most people share my political views, or to go to school, a place where most people share my political views, might be another way to ask this. Consistently conservative people, 50% say it's important. Consistently liberal, 35%. People in the middle are more mixed in their answer. Probably even just as importantly, most of my close friends share my political views. 60% of conservatives say that. Nearly about half of liberals. Right? It means that we're less and less likely to encounter ideas with which we disagree. And because we're not used to meeting ideas or viewpoints or perspectives from others, we don't know how to handle disagreement, right? We don't know how to talk to a conservative. We believe maybe, for example, that a conservative is the other, right? We don't know a conservative, right? I grew up with friends. Everyone like me shared my political views. I go to a university and decide on a major where everyone like me shares my political views. My professors share my political views. So for me, a conservative is like a pundit on Fox News, or it's a denier who can't be reasoned with, right? And they can't possibly support the same things I might support. And we see this type of polarization happening even among the expert community. So I've done a series of studies looking at the membership of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, how they think about politics, how they communicate with the public, how they engage with the media. We also looked at the UK Royal Society in two of the studies. Here's one of the graphs that I take away from that. I looked at, this is AAAS members here in the blue. And on this graph, there are these different social groups and audience groups are placed by the percentage mix that are either Republican or Democrat, so their like-mindedness in terms of partisanship, and their like-mindedness in terms of ideology. So you can see that AAAS members, in terms of their political like-mindedness, in terms of their political composition, right? There's about 55% self-identify as liberal and about 55% self-identify as Democrat. They're as like-minded in their social networks and in their membership almost as Mormon church members or Tea Party members, right? This other on the other side, who we often think is closed-minded and cut off from reality, but the social networks and groups that we've moved through are similarly homogenous in their outlook. You can see the other social groups or audience groups that are more diverse in their political outlook down here. The general public fits here. And what does this mean? This is, I have a paper that's just now coming out in a couple months at the Annals and the American Academy of Political and Social Science, and we look at the political awareness of AAAS members. And in the wake of the George W. Bush administration, how many of them were aware or followed the debate over the politicization of science during the Bush administration? And this was very surprising to me at first, but then when I thought through it, it's like, well, this is how it would work in the public. So why should we assume that AAAS members and how they form opinions would be any different from the general public when it comes not science, but to politics? So here you can see strong selective attention and information seeking among liberals who are AAAS members compared to their moderate and conservative counterparts. So among strong liberals who are AAAS members, which are about 25% of the membership, about close to 80% said they had heard a lot about the debate over the Bush administration. And this is compared to just 10% of the public, right? So one segment of the AAAS members, one segment of the scientific community was following very intensely the debate over the Bush administration, whereas the public was pretty much not even aware of it. And the fewer moderates and conservatives among their counterparts were probably actively avoiding the news, right? This is a sign of information seeking and attention, but also avoidance and forgetfulness, right? I'm a conservative, therefore I choose not to recall that the president that I supported was politicizing science, right? This is just how ideology works. In the expert community, the NGO community, the same process that happened among the American public, when it comes to politics, shapes their outlook as well. Okay, so knowing this, I decided that then I needed to understand then what's setting the context for perception for how we understand political progress and social change on climate change. And this is when I came back to then research that I've been doing on the general public and the role of framing. 3 years ago, I'd be giving you a talk on how framing influences judgments and decisions among the public about climate change, particularly looking at the potential to open up the conversation when you start to talk about public health. But I think a very similar process is happening among the elite community as well. So how does framing work? Remember, climate change is this wicked problem. So if I gave you this ambiguous stimulus up here on the board, right, you may have different ideas about what that ambiguous stimulus or thing might be, this uncertain, complex thing, right? But if I set the context for you on climate change, like Al Gore did or Tom Friedman might do in his best-selling book, that it's the ultimate market failure and the solution is a price on carbon, you might see the solutions very clearly there. What ultimately is uncertain to you now becomes very clear. In this example, this uncertain stimulus is now very clearly a B when you set the context around 2 letters, or you tell a story about climate change as being a market failure and a carbon pricing problem. Once I set that frame of reference for you, right? Once you invest in the idea that climate change is a market failure and needs a price on carbon, and that's the only solution, it's very difficult for me to show you that figure, just like it is now, for me to shift you from perceiving that figure as a B, or shift you from thinking about climate change in those terms, right? Though people are trying to do so, right, as I'll talk about. So a different set of arguments, specific people I'll be talking about in a second, argue that we've always misdefined, we've fundamentally misdiagnosed climate change as a social problem. It's not a market failure, it's an innovation problem. It's not an environmental problem, it's an energy innovation problem. And it's also a societal resilience problem. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to change the conversation about the issue so we see the solutions differently. Something that I'll talk about those solutions in a second. Naomi Klein is trying to do the same thing. The Climate March is trying to do the same thing. In this case, the story is that climate change is about social justice. And the solution is a mass mobilization. And the market is not the answer. In fact, it's the problem. Okay, so who are these storytellers? Who is Naomi Klein in terms of how we think about their social significance? Someone like Tom Friedman, someone like Nicholas Stern, the UK economist, or Al Gore, Bill McKibben up here in the left, David Suzuki. So in a paper that actually just came online today at Widely Interdisciplinary Reviews Climate Change, I look at the role that public intellectuals, as best-selling authors, as writers, as political figures play in setting the context for our perception around climate change as a social problem and shaping what we think should be done about it. And so who is a public intellectual? What are their differences other than the fact that they're, in this case, all but one is white and all but one is a woman and only 2 are smiling, right? How can we think about their differences in their influence? Well, there's sort of, and Boston University actually is part of this tradition. Going back 20 years, there's been a lot of discussion about who is a public intellectual, how do they shape debates? Well, one thing that these people do is that they don't just write for a specialist audience. Many of them do publish in the peer-reviewed research, peer-review areas. But they write popular books, essays, op-eds that drive a lot of attention, like Bill McKibben's Rolling Stone article, or Bill McKibben, who wrote the first popular book about climate change in 1989, The End of Nature, or Naomi Klein's book that's just out. So they write for or engage a broader public on matters of popular concern rather than narrowly targeting an expert audience and emphasizing the more technical details of debate. Importantly, they don't just translate expert knowledge, but they specialize and sometimes specialize in questioning and providing a synthesis of complex interdisciplinary areas of research, engaging in deductive analysis across cases and events, working from the top down, drawing connections, making inferences, and offering judgments. And importantly, they don't just offer a neutral point of view. They argue on behalf of specific causes and policies. Serving in the role of social critic, someone like Andrew Revkin, as he's moved to the opinion pages, has served as a science critic, as someone who reinterprets often studies as they come out, or serves as a convener of debate around those studies, getting a lot of feedback from what he calls the invisible middle of expert views. As an advocate or as an activist, Naomi Klein or Bill McKibben are two examples in that tradition. And not only do they engage in a certain type of writing and argumentation, but they're also significantly, as part of their authority and their influence, they're major personalities. They're part of they become part of and they feed off of our celebrity culture, where we want to understand complex problems through the lens of a personality or a celebrity that we admire or a familiar brand, right? So as Al Gore did in Inconvenient Truth, or David Suzuki does in his own documentary, Force of Nature, they often merge public and private stories. Tom Friedman takes you on a journey around the world as he meets CEOs and business leaders and NGO leaders. Their appearance and their headshot is often consistent with their message and their argument. And it's very important for someone like Bill McKibben or Naomi Klein. There's a lot of discussion about what kind of house do they live in? How often do they fly, right? They have to communicate to you, especially if they're activists, that they walk the walk, they practice what they preach. And they're also major, major commodities. Ironically enough, for someone like Naomi Klein's book, there's a huge amount of money being transacted around their book. And Bill McKibben, for example, blurbs almost every single book that comes out that's in the tradition that he argues. And Tom Friedman probably is the best example of this commodification that they're part of. But most importantly, what they do for us, the way that they frame the significance of a social problem like climate change, is that they promote a common storyline about the issue, defining who or what is to blame, what should be done, and what action would mean for the future. And what these discourses do, in the wake of Inconvenient Truth, when these foundations came together to put together a blueprint for how to invest on climate change, they reflected in part the discourse that Al Gore offered in Inconvenient Truth. Maybe not intentionally so, but that discourse informally guided, shaped their perceptions and the language and their decisions around what should we fund and how should we fund it and what's the path forward. Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein come along and they challenge that discourse. They offer up a rival discourse. And for the climate march, many people in the climate march, that discourse and the groups involved helped them come together to understand a common strategy and understand what does climate change mean to them. And as I talked about, once we get locked in with a particular discourse, we need other public intellectuals. Journalists themselves won't do it, right? Naomi Klein is coming along now, and she's trying to disrupt our thinking about climate change and what it means. Others that I'll talk about in a second, people like Roger Palkey Jr. and Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus, have been trying to do this for a long time, taking on the market-based focus of, say, the Design to Win report. So we need other public intellectuals to come along and disturb the canonical peace and defamiliarize the obvious by identifying the flaws in conventional wisdom and by offering alternative renderings of a problem. So in this paper that I've come out, I go through the arguments of three different camps of public intellectuals who historically and today continue to organize for us what climate change means as a wicked problem. Looking at how do they frame the problem, what is their outlook on nature? There's always an explicit or at least implicit argument about nature. What is their outlook on technology? What are their policy proposals? And what is their model of social change? And as I've been promoting the paper on Twitter, I've been saying that this table in this paper, I intended to serve as your decoder device and trying to decode the arguments that are swirling around, say, the climate march or where to go from here. So a group of public intellectuals, Bill McKibben, David Suzuki, Clive Hamilton, who's an ethicist in Australia, George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian, is a UK author, Naomi Klein and Paul Kingsnorth, who's a UK essayist. They're often referred to, and I refer to them in the paper, as ecological activists. They share a common discourse and storyline about what climate change means. And this discourse is on the rise, as the climate march showed. For them, capitalism, consumerism has exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet, risking catastrophe, or even the decline of our species, as Hamilton argues. Nature for them is the sacred, fragile place. In fact, humans have always gone to nature to seek their salvation. It has divine qualities, and often, as scholars have written, the way that they write about nature is religious in character. In terms of their outlook on technology, they prefer things that are above ground and that are created, quote unquote, through natural processes, and that are not corporate controlled or nationally controlled, but are local and appropriate. This is a language in a tradition that goes all the way back to the 1970s. So they favor things like small-scale, locally owned solar, wind, geothermal, and efficiency. And they have a strong skepticism, if not open antagonism, towards ideas like nuclear energy, carbon capture and storage, and geothermal, in part because they argue these technologies allow us to maintain the original sin, which is economic growth, consumerism, and the damage that we've done to nature. In terms of policy proposals, they've been generally skeptical of things like cap and trade, and they call for things like rationing or strong regulation. But most importantly, their model of social change is that change will only happen by taking on the status quo, developing a new consciousness through social movements and protest. And as Naomi Klein argues, on a scale with what happened in the anti-slavery movement or against colonialism. People like Clive Hamilton and Paul Kingsnorth actually say, well, it's too late for the human species. And what activism does, it's a positive psychological coping mechanism, which allows us to cope with our eventual decline. What I often tell my students who are going out to the Marchant, I think this is a valid point, or getting arrested in front of the White House, I said, go and read their books, right? Go behind sort of the call to action and read what their hoped-for future might be. All of you are in college, right? And the future that they argue for is this future where we'll rarely travel, we'll experience the world through the internet, we'll spend part of our time, most of our time, or a lot of our time raising our own food, we'll share jobs with other people, we'll rely on small-scale intermittent solar and wind in efficiency. And I say to them, is this the future that you buy into? If this is the future you buy into, by all means, go and protest, right? But if you read the final chapter of Naomi Klein's book, this is where she takes us. Or if you read Bill McKibben going back to 1989. In the middle here, you see smart growth reformers, people like Tom Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, Al Gore, Nicholas Stern, Jeffrey Sachs, who's a Columbia economist, and Amory Lovins, who's a longtime renewables and energy efficiency expert and advocate. For them, as the Design to Win report kind of clearly framed the problem, climate change is the ultimate market failure, as Nicholas Stern says. And it's corrected by putting a price on carbon. And there's a strong story from people like Gore that what's blocked action is the climate denial movement. There's also a strong story about that among ecological activists. They argue that nature has limits, but using some of the language from the international process, those limits can be stretched if we adopt the right market-based approaches. And market pricing will drive the adoption of renewables, energy efficiency. But importantly, this is interesting, Nicholas Stern and Jeffrey Sachs diverge from people like Gore in saying that we really need to focus on decarbonization around nuclear and carbon capture and storage. Whereas Gore says, I'm skeptical of these things are risky, and the market will decide if we need them. And what they argue is we need government support for these technologies. They call for a binding international agreement, national carbon pricing, and government investment in innovation. And they've always believed that social change happens through economics and science, a technocratic view of social change. But over the last couple of years, they've grown more similar to ecological activists in arguing for mobilization or third parties. Both Tom Friedman and Jeffrey Sachs have argued for the need for third parties to rise up in American politics. And finally, down below, this is a lesser-known group, but this is actually a group over the years that I've come to share more of their outlook. And these are a group that call themselves, and I call in the paper, eco-modernists. So Stuart Brand, who is an environmental entrepreneur and activist from the 1960s, the Whole Earth Catalog, Mike Hume, who I mentioned before, Roger Pelkey Jr. is a political scientist at the University of Colorado, Steve Rayner, who's an anthropologist at Oxford University, Ted Nordhaus and Michael Schellenberger, who run the Breakthrough Institute, and then Andrew Revkin, who writes for the New York Times. There's other examples within these discourse groups. But what they've argued for a long time is that climate change has been misdiagnosed as a conventional environmental problem like acid rain. and in terms of market failure. But in fact, we should see the problem as really as a technological innovation problem that can address the energy access needs and the growth demands of the world, and also a societal resilience challenge. In fact, they've been long-standing critical of people like the smart growth reformers. They haven't focused enough on the role of government, believing that the market is the driving instrument, and on societal resilience. Remember the funding programs I showed you, there's little funding at all for resilience or adaptation. In terms of technology, they argue, and I think correctly, that renewables, and as I showed you earlier in some of our energy source mix, and I'd be interested to hear your comments on this, renewables are not going to get us where we need to go in terms of meeting the emissions challenge. And we need government investment in things like nuclear energy, along with renewables, nuclear energy, carbon capture and storage. Importantly, they have a different outlook on nature. They argue that nature is more resilient than fragile. And that in fact, the more we produce a high energy planet with innovative technologies and economic growth, that's one of the best ways to actually conserve nature in the developing world in terms of things like deforestation and other ways that developing countries are now unwisely using their natural resources. In terms of policy proposals, they argue that we can't think about silver bullet type approaches like a binding international agreement or cap and trade. We've been trying that for years, and it's not going to go anywhere. Instead, drawing on insights from the policy sciences around polycentric approaches, we need these incremental, clumsy policy approaches across levels of government in the private and public sectors. And importantly, their model of change is that if we reduce the costs of energy technologies under those conditions and leave a wide menu of policies and technologies on the table, not only do we introduce more opportunities for compromise, people on the left and the right now read into climate change opportunities to achieve their own goals. So on the right, they like nuclear energy and carbon capture and storage. Acting on climate change is a way to continue to invest in those industries, in those technologies. On the left, it's an opportunity to invest in things like renewables and maybe achieve social justice aims. So they argue the role of advocates and for experts should be to keep a wide menu of policy options and technologies on the table. Ultimately, the way I see this playing out is, and they tend to be skeptical of mass mobilization, but the way I see these things connected is that the type of march that happened on Sunday and the political pressure that people like Tom Steyer are engaging in election campaigns, once elected officials are willing to return to the business of governing and they get into the room to try to decide what to do about climate change, I think it's from this discourse that they're going to have the options and technologies on the table by which to reach agreement and maybe a more realistic ability to actually meet both our growth and our emissions challenge. So I've got some ideas on the role that universities can play in kind of serving as forums across these different types of discourses and investing in their own types of disruptive ideas and challenging the next generation of NGO leaders and experts and scientists and policymakers. But I'll leave that for the Q&A. And if you want to find the papers that I covered in this talk, if you go to climateshiftproject.org/studies, you can see a series of papers that I've written over the last 3 years, gradually starting to get at these issues, starting with a paper I wrote while I was on sabbatical at the Kennedy School, to the journal article that just came out, and then a forthcoming study looking at how scientists think about the politics of science, and then a book chapter that's coming out on really looking at the election campaign and Tom Steyer. So thank you.